Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. As I mentioned in the prior video, we're skipping over some of the intervening verses from 17 to 24 that deal with Cain's wives and offspring and cities and so forth. We're going to go back to the start. We're going to go back to Adam and Eve and see what happens with them. Egno de Adam yuan, ten gunaika autu, ke sulabusa eteken huion, ke ep onomasen ta anima autu Seth. And we'll continue with the second half of the verse here in a minute. Well, notice that our conjunction here is de, and typically, and I mentioned this in the prior video because the same thing happened, typically Kai has been our main linking conjunction. Here, though, the de is marking an advancement of the narrative, moving us out of the sub-narrative involving Cain. And so you don't have to necessarily translate it with a but just be aware that we're moving things forward. And we're back to Adam, and the verb here is egno, and you'll notice a spelling change. A bunch of letters have dropped out. E on the front end. This is the third singular aorist active indicative of gnosko. Very common word. It does typically mean to know, but of course in this context, we're not talking about knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. This is a common euphemism both in Greek and Hebrew for the intimate act of knowing. And so Adam knew Eve. And so this, of course, is referring to essentially the marital act. Now, keep in mind, what's interesting here is that the Masoretic text does not actually have her name here. And so it's unclear if the Genesis translator has a Hebrew text in front of him that does, or if he's just simply trying to remind us that this is Eve, the mother of the living. God has not forgotten that, even though one of her sons has died, making it sort of interesting that she's the mother of the living, which is what Heua means, or where we get the yuan there. Either way, we're not sure but where the translator's getting it, but it's a nice callback to her name. The Hebrew, as we have in the Masoretic, just has the wife here, Tain Gunaika. So Adam knew Eve, his wife. And so what's the outcome of that? And sulabusa. This is from sulambano. So you'll notice that we have a spelling change to lab. This is actually a soon on the front end, but it's nasalized with the double L there. You got a usa ending, so all that tells you this is a nominative singular feminine aorist active participle, and this means to conceive in the womb. And so something like after conceiving, then what's our main verb? Eteken. This is from tikto. We've seen that before in prior chapters. This is a third singular aorist active indicative. Tikto means to bear, not in the sense of to carry a load, but to give birth to. You could also say that. So she birthed. So having conceived, she birthed a son. And so this is good news that even though one has been struck down, God has blessed her with the ability, with the fertility really, to produce another son. And so we have another verb here, which is from ep onomazo. You can tell that anima is underneath that. This is a third singular aorist active indicative again. So notice a bunch of aorists driving the narrative. So she named, and then the name, and it's his name. So she named his name Seth. And Seth in Hebrew means something like appointed one or designated one or the one who has been placed. And so he is now this provision of God to continue the righteous offspring, if you will, of Eve. But we're not done. Let's continue on. How does Eve respond to this good news? Legusa ex anetesen gar moi hatheos, sperma heteron anti Habel, han apektenen Kain. Which is kind of a nice little wraparound to the start of this whole chapter. So legusa is referring again back to Eve. Notice that it has the usa ending. This is, again, a nominative singular feminine. This happens to be a present active participle from lego. So here we have her saying, if you will, or we have a gar here, and it's in postpositive position, but why has she named him the appointed one, Seth? So this is a nice for. She's explaining why. The subject here is hatheos, and so he's the one who has intervened. And what's the verb? Ex anetesen. This is from ex anestemi, which means to raise up. The ending there with the sen, some minor spelling changes. This is a third singular aorist active indicative. Of course, this is a me verb, so you may not know that paradigm, but this one's fairly straightforward to figure that one out. So for, God has raised up to me. God has answered to Eve's plight. So she is now being blessed by God, a sperma. Notice it's also another offspring, another seed. Anti here does not mean against, by the way. This means in place of, typically. Even though in English, anti typically means against, but not in Greek. It means in place of here. Abel. And so this is a lovely callback to Genesis 3:15 that I alluded to previously. She had been promised in Genesis 3:15 a sperma, an offspring, that would do battle with the offspring of the serpent. Of course, Abel has been struck down, raising the question, if Cain is disqualified because of his fratricide, is there going to be a sperma? And the answer from God to Eve is yes. This is the new promised sperma. Now, why is he needed? Han is referring back to Abel, and then the verb here is from apoktenos, a third singular aorist active indicative, because Cain killed him, or whom Cain killed. So if we step back, here's the full sentence in case you want to track along the full thing. So saying, for explaining why she named him Seth, God has raised up for me offspring and another offspring in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. That would be the best way to translate that. So a glimmer of hope here as Adam and Eve emerge from the devastation of the death of Abel. God has intervened and provided Seth. So lovely way that wraps around. If Cain is the first installment of this battle from Genesis 3:15 against the offspring of the serpent, now we have Eve with a new offspring that can advance the promise.